Anthony Albanese will be bringing a couple of messages to the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Summit here in Jakarta. One is the consistent message that Australia has been pushing for quite some time, that there needs to be a rules-based order in this region to solve conflicts and disputes. It's very rare that Australian Prime Ministers or Foreign Ministers directly mention China, but it's an obvious reference, particularly to territorial disputes in the South China Sea, that there should be negotiations and things like international agreements and the international UNCLOS ruling from several years ago, which basically invalidated the basis of many of China's claims in the South China Sea, that those sorts of things should be respected. So expect Anthony Albanese to be reiterating Australia's position that there does need to be norms and rules to manage disputes in the region. But the other thing, Bev, we're expecting to hear is the unveiling of a Southeast Asian economic strategy for Australia. On Wednesday morning here in Jakarta, Anthony Albanese will give an address where he's expected to talk about efforts for Australia to deepen economic links in this region. Of course, there is a huge over-reliance for Australian exports on China. So if there is a way for Australian exporters to somewhat balance the export destinations in the region and actually sell more products into Southeast Asia, that would obviously be probably strategically better for Australia. So expect Anthony Albanese to be talking about that in some more detail once he's here in Jakarta.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you point out, how strategically contentious this region has become. Yet the leaders of both the US and China are no-shows. How important is that?
Well, you have to remember that about this time last year, both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping were in Indonesia for the G20, where they held extensive talks. So there is a bit of disappointment here, certainly, that neither of the two leaders will be turning up for the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Summit, especially given that Joe Biden will be attending the G20 in India at the end of the week. For China, quite often over the years, you've had the number two leader, the premier, attend these sorts of summits. That's happening again this week. Li Qiang will be here, then he will be going to the G20. As for the United States, they're sending Vice President Kamala Harris here to Indonesia. So there definitely is some disappointment, I think, from Southeast Asian leaders that the heads of state of those countries are not turning up. But given that they were here a year ago, I don't think it's seen as too much of a missed opportunity, perhaps also because it's likely they will be meeting later this year at the APEC summit in San Francisco.
We know, Bill, that many of the ASEAN countries, the Philippines in particular, want to push for some sort of code of conduct in the South China Sea. China, it appears, really just seem to have another idea.
Yeah, well, we saw a report this week saying that this was a senior ASEAN official saying that China and ASEAN have agreed to conclude or try to conclude talks on a code of conduct within 3 years, and that we will see that 3-year pledge formalised this week here at the ASEAN or the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Summit. Now, that would be rather ambitious because there have been about 20 years of fruitless talks on this idea of setting some sort of binding guidelines for interactions in the South China Sea. There is deep suspicion among Southeast Asian nations that China has been stalling these talks and trying to put in place conditions that are unacceptable to the other claimant nations to try and prolong the negotiations with the purpose of cementing China's control of the islands and the reclaimed reefs. And so perhaps there is some sign of confidence from the Chinese government that if they now feel that the militarised islands are pretty much completed and therefore they can try and complete some sort of code over the next few years. But countries like the Philippines, Bev, that you mentioned, we've just been up there last week, they've basically given up, I think, on trying to have a code of conduct that achieves anything. They're now taking other measures. They've been holding military drills with the Australian military. They've been granting extended access to the American military. They've been trying to promote tourism in the islands in the South China Sea that they still control. So I don't think there is a huge amount of optimism, even if there is an accelerated push for talks on a code of conduct, that it would necessarily lead to a concluded document or that that document would actually have any particular value when it is finally completed.
Yeah. Good to talk, Bill. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Bev.